Welcome to On Fighting in Thailand, the best news and analysis covering the economics and infrastructure of Muay Thai. I'm Matt Lucas, journalist, commentator, and ex-Muay Thai fighter. Make stronger fighters, make stronger people. Today we will be talking to Tony Myers, who is a very, very experienced judge and referee from the UK. Spent a lot of time in Thailand, especially as one of the first UK practitioners to come to the land of smiles. And he brought a lot of knowledge back home with him to the UK. I think one of my first sort of interactions with Tony was through his scoring website, which is very informative and very interesting. He's done a number of academic papers, one of which I remember being the impact of crowd noise on judging and in terms of home field advantage. So there is a bias for judging, and according to his research, and again, you'll need to double check with this, it's about a half a point bias towards the hometown. And why judges will sort of swing that way is because of the impact of crowd noise. So a very important takeaway there, how important it is to be cheering for your fighters in order to sometimes sway those very, very close decisions. In this episode, though, we talk more about the history of the sport, especially in the UK, and go through his timeline of starting out in karate and then moving into Muay Thai. We also hit on some notable names, William Hastings and, of course, Dean James. So without further ado, the interview with Tony Myers. Thank you, Tony, for taking your time out today. I know you're a busy man. I really appreciate it. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. And it's always a pleasure to speak.
So you've obviously been in the sport for a very long time, since the 70s, and you first went to Thailand, I believe, in the 80s. What were your beginnings, though? You began in karate and were doing some stand-up striking and sort of wrestling, correct?
That was right. Yeah, so karate background, really, and that was, I guess, early 70s. At that time, karate was sort of and kung fu had just started to come in, but I was doing karate, Shotokan karate, and I guess I wanted to make it more realistic, so we were mixing boxing with it, so it was a bit of a hybrid between boxing and karate, but also did a little bit of jiu-jitsu, Japanese jiu-jitsu, not to any extent, but we then tried to incorporate that. So I guess it looked a little bit like a bad version of MMA, a less skilled, polished version of MMA at the time. From then, it was a number of guys trained with me and were interested in competing, and we were looking for outlets. And I guess had there been MMA, then that would have been an outlet. But it was looking to see where, and this was sort of the end of the 80s. Sort of, I decided with a friend to put on some shows and to contact people who at that time were fighting. So there was a scene then. In the Midlands and in Manchester and also in London, but at that time I recruited from both areas, from Manchester, the Midlands and London, and we had fighters on there. And I guess the fighters I had competed, what I was most impressed with, I guess, at the time was some fighters from Tony Moore's gym. Technically, not necessarily, there were some great fighters, Steve Denton comes to mind, and some others. They were, quite well-known fighters at that point. And I had done some training with what then was freestylers, but became Trojan, who I had a stronger link with later on. But at that point, I decided to contact Tony Moore, who brought a guy called Paul Bates down, who had actually fought some Thais at that time, and sort of went up to do some training. My guys at the time looked a bit like kickboxers with knees rather than really Muay Thai style fighters. And it was the contacts I had with Tony, really, that led me to Thailand. And it was the early 90s I first ventured to Thailand with two fighters I had at the time. That was Yuk Fung and Will Hastings, both who were competing at that point. And we ended up at a gym south of Bangkok, Bampay. We actually it hadn't had foreigners there at that point. We helped construct the ring. We slept on camp beds with mosquito nets over, so it wasn't particularly set up at that point for foreigners. And the gym we trained with actually were operated outside of the coach's house. It was the gym was actually his garden. I think Tong, his name was. I think later on he became mayor of the area. But he had a guy who was fighting at Lumpini, and they were very friendly, and it was a nice time to sort of very accommodating. They brought all the champions in for us to look at, and so it was that's really the first exposure to Muay Thai, and that really was for me really great because it was sort of, I don't know, we tried to using martial arts and tried to make things work, the karate things work, but this did work. It was all very sort of made real sense. And from then on, went back to Thailand, Chiang Mai the following year, and then I guess the turning point for me, went with Yuk Fung again. The turning point was a contact that Tony Moore gave me, which was Chok Chai Chana Krutsuwan, who was that time at Pinsin Chai Gym, his nickname Pimu. And I contacted him. I'd gone actually to, I guess, the usual sort of haunts of foreigners, Khao San Road, and contacted him from there. And he said, look, come across. It was situated near Ngo Min. So I went across, stayed he put me up in an apartment. And I trained at the gym, which was hugely impressed with Pinsin Chai Gym at the time. I think it had about 6 champions and had a great history of fighters up to that point as well. So a very young Thailand Pinsin Chai, who's still a coach and was a successful champion, but lots of others, including some older boxers at the time, Sanchin Narapai, who was a multiple champion, and Bergluk as well at that time. So there were a range of fighters at that point. There was about 6 champions, but also some former champions. So it was a great time to go there at the beginning of the 90s and see, I guess, what some people consider to be one of the golden eras of Muay Thai, and see the training. And it was the gym at that time, and I think it still is, sort of backs on from General Pinsin Chai was the owner's house and garden. And it was Pimu I was impressed with for his technical, I guess, attention to detail. So he was using all these very top boxers to illustrate points, but it was his technical detail, and also he was very amenable, and he was sort of telling me about the scoring, because I was interested. I'd come from boxing, but I'd boxed minimally, but I had boxed, and that I guess as a child what I was interested in watching. So I was interested how, when he took me to Lumpini, for example, and Lads will learn, how were they scoring the fights? What were they doing? So he spent a long time, making notes about the techniques in the day, and then afterwards about how things were scored. And that, I guess, was the start of my real interest in the technical aspects and also the scoring aspects of Muay Thai.
And what was the scene, I guess, like? Because you were one of the earlier foreigners and definitely early UK people to go over to Thailand. What was Thailand like at the time? And, like you said before, you were also there basically during the golden era when Pinsin Chai was a notable gym.
Obviously a great time for me. I think it was much less commercial generally. I think the Muay Thai scene, whereas now I think Muay Thai gyms realise the potential for foreigners to come in. At that time they were not suspicious, but they were welcome. But it was also with some why, so why, if you've got a good job, you come into a Muay Thai gym to learn Muay Thai. It was that for them it was a job, and that so it was. They got on really well with them and had relationships. Like Thailand came to my house, a number of times years later, and we've had a relationship ever since with some of the other boxers and some of the other gyms Pimu took me to afterwards. But I think Thailand was less commercial. It was generally an interesting place, particularly travelling around Thailand. I think it was interesting to go to. I think it was probably cheaper. I remember going with 200 UK pounds, and that was for a couple of months, and managed to make that last. I don't know, that wouldn't be the case now. I didn't have to pay for training. There was no paying for training or anything. It was
really
no.
Wow.
Not at that point. It was just training.
It was probably 50 baht to the pound at that point.
Probably, yeah. It might have even been a point. Yeah, it might have even been at some points even less. But yeah, it was cheap anyway.
45, 50, which is quite a lot. That's a lot of sticky rice per pound.
Yeah, I remember that first time it was about, we were budgeting because we were a bit naive and we didn't book a return flight. And the time we wanted to go back, it was quite busy. We really were on a tight budget. I think we managed to live on about 30p a day for food at that point.
Yeah, that's still a decent amount of sticky rice. You can get some curry and lad cow. It's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, it was.
So you were there. How long were you there for when you made these trips?
I used to go. Again, I worked in education, so I was able to take a fair chunk. So sometimes a month, sometimes 2 months, and I'd go each year. I
Mm,
went for a long time, for sometimes twice a year, but generally in the summer months in the UK.
hmm
So it'd sometimes be rainy season in Thailand. It was usually between sort of, I don't know, June and September period, really.
hmm Oh, were you fighting or were you just training and sort of looking at things?
No, I was just trying. I was already into my 30s when I went, so I was already,
Mm-hmm.
particularly when I went to Pintin Chai Gym. I thought, you know what, the standards just,
Yeah.
I'm more interested in learning how to teach it because I just don't think,
hmm
in all honesty, at that age and my previous experience, I would be, the guys were just levels ahead of me. And I thought it's a superb chance to learn. And that's where I think I'll be able to use that and apply it into coaching rather than me competing and fighting. Obviously, I kicked pads and did all the clinching and the rest
hmm
of the training. But, in all honesty, that was the way I thought about it. So I boxed in my 20s, but I just thought by the time I went to Pintin Chai, I was probably 33, 34.
hmm
Would have been fine if I'd have been competing
hmm
up into training in Muay Thai. Up until then, it would have been a great chance to sort of polish those skills and go on. But I really felt I needed to learn all the fundamentals or relearn all the fundamentals I might have thought I knew prior to that.
hmm Yeah, that makes sense. There was also not the same level of opportunities for foreign fighters to correctly be matched up as well.
No, later on, obviously, had a number of fighters who went to be matched, but they were
hmm
really through my coach Pimu, who managed to
hmm
get good matches for them at the stadiums and in bet fights in the north, etc.
And then when you would go back to the UK, what was the scene like, especially during these early trips? What were you bringing back, and how was the UK Muay Thai scene developing?
At that point, it looked a different sport. In all honesty, it was, I think, influenced strongly by kickboxing. Many shows had to incorporate just to get enough fights on for the public to watch. Had to incorporate kickboxing. Some of the referees and officials were from kickboxing or full contact karate backgrounds. So I think the scoring and the way that the techniques were delivered looked quite different. There was also some Dutch influences, so again with the Kyokushinkai from, the links to Holland with Kyokushinkai. So it looked different. And what was done in Thailand was, it didn't look like the same sport in all honesty at some points. But I was interested in teaching and, implementing the knowledge that I'd gained. So I was also sort of commenting on, hang on, are we doing the right scoring? Are we doing the best thing we can here in the UK? At that point, I was part of the British Thai Boxing Council. I think was Tony Moore was the president. I think I was the vice president at some point and the treasurer at other points. And at that point in the UK, there was a move. So probably 91, if my memory serves me correctly. We were trying to get recognised by the Sports Council in the UK, and there were several of us who went to the Sports Council. Some of those were kickboxers. That's for those doing Muay Thai at the time. We represented different organisations, and so I was representing the British Thai Boxing Council at that time.
Mm.
We were not successful. We're trying to get a hybrid, and I don't think that was necessarily the best approach. And I also think if we'd have been more coordinated, we could have chosen some better representatives to go, because I don't think everyone there representing with that used to dealing with public officials. And I think, we really probably missed an opportunity. But at that point, they didn't recognise, they chose not to recognise the sport, and it was an ongoing. Well, it's still to this day, the Sports Council don't recognise the sport. I think different countries associated do, so Ireland do, Republic of Ireland do. Scotland almost did at some point, and obviously France and other countries, but the UK as a whole still doesn't. I think it's developed on from then. I think, there is now IFMA and there's some links with, the amateur events, the amateur sport, for example. But,
Yeah.
I think it's a different dynamic now professionally across the world. than it was at that point. But so, yeah, as far as the techniques go and as far as the way the sport looked and was officiated and the way that people trained was quite different in Thailand. Yeah, Prachatu.
And
Yeah.
then
So it was.
when did you open the gym in Birmingham, and how did that get started? Pra Sua.
Originally, it was, as I say, I had these shows in the the late 80s. So the gym started in the early 90s. So really, I guess we'd started the gym just prior to me going to Thailand. So that meant really when I'd come back with the technique of that year, it all changed. This is what we do now. So the guys at the time training were going, oh, we were doing this, but now we changed. And so I was constantly trying to say, we straight away, anything that, previously I'd done that I was mistaken in delivering would change. So I'm sure the guys at the time adapted really well. They did very well competitively. At that time, given the nature of the way the sport developed and the gyms I'd gone to, Pinching Chai, for example, clinch work and knee was quite strong at Pinching Chai and not so strong in the UK. So I think with the gym at that time had a reputation for clinch work and knee, and they did very, very successful. Will Hastings, I think in '96, was sort of won a British title in Birmingham, and that was on Steve Logan's show at the Tao Ballroom, which was a venue that was quite popular at that period and for a period after. And Damien Trainer, if you spoke to him, he would have fought there lots of times. In fact, I would have refereed Damien lots of times from a young lad at that venue. And Will fought, and that was the first time a British title had been fought with elbows. And Will won that title, and he went on to have about 60 fights. So I think Combat Magazine or the BTV voted him best fighter of the year at that year. He got a good run at that point, and he was, I guess, the best fighter, the most experienced fighter of that gym. His weight was quite good, and we fought in Holland, France, etc., around the UK. Yuki Fung, who was fighting slightly before Will, was a bit smaller and had to actually have fights with guys much, much bigger. So it was more difficult to match. I guess he was in the 50s and then, sort of 53, 54. So he's fighting guys sometimes 10 Ks heavier to get fights.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a few people, we had some that entered amateurs. We had, there was a,
yeah.
I went as British team coach in the 90s. But also, to be honest, that was the Republic of Ireland joined us, even though they wouldn't have been part of the British team. They sort of were part of the group. They wouldn't want to be called the British team, and they weren't. But and that might have been 96. It was in Utrecht, and we competed against, in the amateurs. And there wasn't the shin pads on then. There was still the head guards and the body shields on. And the year after, I went again with the Irish team. Actually, wasn't with the British team then. I was with the Irish team, and Craig O'Flynn won a silver. So I cornered Craig. There was only a couple of lads who went out, and I went with him because Anthony, his coach at the time, couldn't go out, and I knew him quite well, so I went out with them. So from then, I really didn't focus on amateur sport, but it was a great chance to go to Thailand and compete and refereed. I refereed at the later on for IFMA on TV and Thai TV, which was, so it gave me some nice opportunities, even though I was and still am more focused on the professional sport. Coaching the professional sport.
Did you referee for the WMC then? Because you did some IFMA stuff.
Yes, I refereed. So I did the IFMA training at that time. I think the original courses were actually very good. And I was qualified by the WMC, and so I refereed. Not in Thailand for the WMC though. I didn't referee in Thailand. I refereed in the UK on WMC shows at that time.
The WMC, I believe, really sort of took off in the late 90s and went into, at its heyday was in the early 2000s with a big presence, mainly in Australia, but also had a bit of a presence in the UK.
Yeah, I went to the early meetings, I think maybe 1999, I went to a meeting and, a couple of meetings. I represented the BTBC anyway. At World Muay Thai Council meetings. In fact, one I still use some of the videos from that time. I think a very young Anawat Kausam Rick was demonstrating some techniques, and so at that time they were videoing what schools and what didn't. So it was still a use. And I use that footage in some of the training courses because it was quite good. They actually stood out in front and were sort of explaining things. So so I went to those. I think it maybe yeah, 98, 99, maybe a couple of years, maybe 2002, with a few.
You sort of shifted more into doing referee stuff in the late 90s then?
Well, it wasn't shifted more to, I was doing it as well, so I'd already started doing some refereeing prior to really training properly in Thailand.
Hmm.
It was just alongside coaching. So then I'd be coaching a couple of different gyms. In fact, at some point, three different gyms.
Hmm.
There was
Hmm.
my own gym, Trojan Gym in Cheltenham, and Trojan Gym in Wolverhampton. And I was refereeing and judging as well. So I guess in the 90s,
Hmm.
maybe 98, I had my coach come to the UK, so Pimu, and we did seminars, Muay Thai seminars, but also started doing judging seminars and referee seminars at that point. Initially, without any assessment at all, it was just literally, this is how the sport's done in Thailand, this is how it's scored. It was almost a matter of interest rather than training people. And then it became more, I carried on doing those to train people how to judge and referee. But again, no assessment initially. And it was only when I realised actually some people who'd sat through the course still were not bringing anything or not able to apply it, I guess. So we then started doing some testing to see whether people, how many fights people could score. Quite, I guess, a simplistic method of showing people 10 fights and saying of different things, particular things, emphasising particular things that were key in scoring and saying, who do you think's won, why? And that was the basis of it, really. The refereeing, we less developed in assessing the refereeing because I think it's a one-off was less easy to do, even though at that point you had sort of simulated fights and some people would be trying to cheat and throw themselves on the floor. Could you protect the boxer? Could you move around? Which was actually sort of done in some of the training in Thailand too. But it was more like given the scenario over a period of time, it was more a competency based thing to say, when this happens, have you demonstrated you can deal with this appropriately? So can you count appropriately? Can you protect someone on the floor? Can you break boxers on the ropes in the centre of the ring? Or can you separate boxers correctly without them hitting each other or hitting you? And that type of thing. I was lucky enough again as well to have some good. Pimu actually was very good himself, but he also had really good links. One Chai Pricey from Radnam, who was, I think, voted referee of the year in 2003. I think, teaches boxers now. He was in the Air Force as well, and he came over to the UK and was, instrumental in sort of teaching some things and guiding me. I interviewed lots of people, referees from Lumpini and Radhanabang Chan at the time. I think was head of Lumpini judging and refereeing. I interviewed him. I interviewed Sakchai Tapsawan, who was, I think, at that point, head of the Muay Thai Council.
Do you happen to still have access to those interviews?
I've got some written stuff from I use it from a PhD thesis on because it's been I interviewed them in the sort of early 2000s. I don't know whether I've got the video. I don't know whether I've got the actual audio, but I've got what I pulled out of it because it was part of the PhD thesis. So I started a PhD in 2001. So I was sort of qualitative study, actually, that formed part of a chapter which I didn't publish and hasn't been published. Perhaps when I get a chance to, I will, because I think it was quite interesting, some of those conversations. And the idea was to contrast it with interviews I've done and my experiences in the UK, sort of say, how are these things different? And then testing the theory, really, that you can be more consistent if you apply this particular approach. So they were I guess instrumental. And another one later on, Colonel Boonsong Kurt Mani, who was again a very famous referee, and he, I think, when Lumpini, for a period of time, Lumpini changed rules where they didn't allow people to grab around the body to knee. And then they sort of brought all the heads of the different stadiums together, and Colonel Boonsong Kirkman, was the chair of that group, and they sort of went back to so he was obviously quite respected. He was very good, actually. I spent a day with him he looked at me refereeing, he was making points about, so he was very good Came to the gym to, because he used to be a teacher and my coach at the time, in the early days. So yeah, that was where I got into sort of trying to look at the technical aspects and what was there. And we kept, to be honest, got training videos, from referee training videos from Lumpini. I had a book translated from their training manual at the time, translated into English to use as materials, I guess, for the bodies, to deliver stuff, to try and be as authentic as possible, and both technically and in terms of the rules.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you really started after 2000, after your PhD, you really started to do a lot of academic work as well. In 2007, you did the political bias in Muay Thai. You had the keynote speaker at the Danish Muay Thai Federation, the cultural differences in judging Muay Thai, again in 2007. And basically, you did a lot of academic work on the sport into like 2012, 2013, and 14. Can you talk about that period and what you were trying to accomplish and what was happening in the UK at the time as well? As always, if you'd like to follow me, you can do so on Instagram, Matt Lucas Muay Thai. I always respond to messages there. I also have the website, matt-lucas.com, or email me at a.matt.lucas@gmail.com. Thanks to all the people that have supported me so far, sharing the podcast, leaving reviews. If you'd like to leave a review, that would be super helpful. You can do so on the iTunes stores. After years of hard work, studying, and being in the game, I published On Fighting in Thailand, a guide to the sport in the motherland. Is a Muay Thai encyclopedia. It goes over scoring, matchmaking, picking gym, fight styles, gambling, Muay Thai culture, and more. It contains a series of interviews with long-term expat fighters, including Michael Savas, Willie Whipple, Lisa Brealey, Angela Chang, and others. It is a great guide, educates and helps guide careers by helping save fighters from costly mistakes. It is a definitive guide and is available on Amazon as an ebook and in print. So go check it out. On Fighting in Thailand, a guide to the sport in the motherlands.
Yeah, so it was, right from 2001, really, I started doing academic, with the PhD, and some of these studies were out of that PhD. So it was the idea of, I'd gone to the IFMA several times, gone to IFMA World Championships, and I had a feeling that there may be some nationalistic bias. I wasn't particularly thinking people were deliberately biased, and I think it was offset by the number of judges they had. So I don't think it actually influenced results, because they used to have about 5 judges rather than 3. But I wanted to investigate that, and I investigated. So initially, as part of the PhD study, the published study just looks at nationalistic bias, but the PhD extended that a bit further. So I looked at shared language bias and noticed the same effect. So essentially, my conclusions in the PhD was actually there wasn't any deliberate bias, but there was a bias, but that was offset by the number of judges. And it was, I guess, because I was working in academia, it was natural to want to know it a little bit more, but also to sort of challenge my own positions. Is this true or not true? Are my anecdotal experiences really reflected in stronger evidence, I guess? And so, particularly with judging, there was a big debate at the time about, we've been doing the sport a long time in the UK, since the 70s. We're not really going to change it, was one view, and another view was we should be changing it. We should be making it more like Thailand. There's obviously then already commercial interests in Muay Thai in England, and there's some inertia to not change, and some, so there was all sorts of political reasons for various things. But in the end, things did change, and it became, people took on board some of the ideas, and I think things. The training came through, and new people. I'm never sure. Certainly, some people who are in the sport a long time decided to change, and they helped me. Darren Phillips, for example, had trained and been. He's one of the early coaches who came down to bring fighters in the 80s when I put the first shows on, and later on, we had an email exchange and then discussions. He became a friend. but he was one who was really sort of initially as the old school of Muay Thai in the UK, I guess, and he was one who was very passionate in the end, promoted, how it, the sort of the newer ways that we were trying to introduce that were more like Thailand. So they really were instrumental in changing other views. Otherwise, I might have had a more difficult job to get people to reconsider things. But in a way, the academic research was to support those arguments. People saying, well, it's not really, using a holistic system that's used in Thailand isn't really that scientific, and so we're applying more. But actually, the studies we did, for example, one study was let's have a look at the Thais and how consistent they are. Let's have a look at how consistent we are in the UK. Obviously, we can't say one's right. It's about what, it's a constructive, sports constructed, it's a socially constructive thing. And so, but we can say, well, people can be more consistent. And if you're more consistent, that has benefits. People who are training, the coaches and officials, if it's more consistent, we've got a chance to change things in a particular direction, so potentially to get more skillful in something. So we initially looked at the first of the study was a sort of multiple study thing. The first of the study was just to compare Thailand with the UK, and the Thais were considerably more consistent. But the arguments could be, well, what's the cause of that? Well, that could just be that they are professionals. They are working together a lot. They're working together in a stadium. Is it to do with that and not to do with the system they use, for example? So then it was, well, let's try and train a group of UK judges in that system as much as we can and see then how they perform. Does the performance, the consistency improve? And actually they trained over a year and consistency did improve dramatically, really, and more in line with Thailand. Not so much in the actual points, but in terms of agreeing who won the fight. The actual points, I think the way that Thais were judging at the time was slightly different in terms of the awarding points at the end of the fight. They weren't necessarily in round by round scoring, which we were doing and continued to do in the UK. But the consistency was high. It was 90-odd%, 97%. So that supported, I guess, that was another piece in the jigsaw puzzle to support the way that the sport might benefit from being scored the way the Thais do, or at least based on the way that Thais do. And that led to some things like going to other countries, so Canada, the States, Denmark, you mentioned, etc., across the Republic of Ireland, Scotland, the UK. And that came from there. In terms of, it didn't finish in 2014, to be honest. It's continuing. It's just that I have to do other things as well, so I've got to do other research stuff. So we've got a few projects ticking over. So mental toughness in Muay Thai. Look, we've collected lots of data with Stefan Strottmeyer from the States. He came over, to talk about judging, and we've got an potential project on that as well, on judging, on the effects of commentary effects. We've got data still got to do. That's got to be written up. Commentary effects of how the commentator might shape someone's influence or influence on deciding who they think's won, or the fairness of the decision given. And a biomechanics study that's sort of been paused for COVID, but then will carry on, which is sort of looking at technique and what aspects of technique relate to power in different techniques. So it's ongoing, but published studies stopped around 2013, 14, can't remember the exact date. I think the last of the studies was a sort of looking at comparing techniques delivered in Thailand and the UK pre-change of rules. So it wasn't, and so probably it needs a follow-up study to say, did the rules make a difference? Did actually the rules change what we did in the UK? Anecdotally, they did. But whether they did, in more sort of objective measures, I don't know. But I'd suspect that would be the case. But it's a follow-on study, certainly.
Yeah, Damien Trainer, in the interview with him, he definitely suggested that things had changed by then because of the sort of migration of people back and forth and just people's understanding of the scoring system.
I think that's true. I think the opening up Thailand made a great difference, and the fact that people were more willing to change the way the sport was judged, and so I think that made a big difference.
And you went to Philadelphia in 2015 or so to do a seminar with Stefan Strottmeyer, or he came over?
I didn't go to Philadelphia. No, he came over. Stefan came over. I went to New York. So,
You worked with the New York or New Jersey Commission, maybe, correct?
yeah, yeah, that was, yeah. So it was working with the commission, and we put together
Hmm.
some unified rules at the time
Hmm.
with the commission. Stefan was
Hmm.
also part of that group, but Stefan came over to the UK with to look at judging. At the time, he also did some judging, I think, on the
Hmm.
Brian Calder's show at that point. So yeah, he came over and they were looking, so he already was an academic researcher, I think injuries, and done some stuff on injuries in Muay Thai as well. But obviously his interest was in, so he originally took over the idea. It was that we'd formed the what was called the IBMTO, and still is called the IBMTO at that point, the Independent Board of Muay Thai Officials, which we wanted to separate from organising bodies and say, look, anybody, whatever group you're with, you can employ these officials if you want to. That was the idea of it originally. And Stefan came over and opened the USA version of that. I think there was different challenges in the States. So I think he wasn't able to get into some of the athletic commissions. And so in the end, he went a different route with the amateur. He thought there's a better angle. So he changed the name of it and changed slightly the direction. But yeah, using some of the basic principles has continued to do that.
Hmm. And switching a little bit over from your judging and academic work into your actual in the ring experience, the referee stuff. What shows have you worked on? When did you really start beginning refereeing?
Started in the sort of early 90s, and refereed on lots of different shows. I can't remember how many in the UK and in Ireland and Thailand. A couple of times it was televised in Thailand, but Kazakhstan as well. So it was, so right from, I guess it's when I was coaching what looked a bit more like Muay Thai, I was also refereeing and judging, and again trying to polish those things. So constantly going back to Thailand, constantly getting feedback on what my coach would come over every year at that point, sometimes a couple of times a year, and give feedback. He'd bring boxers with him and get feedback on my performance. He'd be saying, "Oh, that wasn't very good. You need to do this, and you need to be quicker on that," or
Hmm.
etc. So I think it was very useful for me, and I'd obviously go back to some of the people he brought over and were teaching. But I think that constant feedback's really very useful. Somebody at ringside saying, "You need to do this," or "This is how we do it in Thailand," was very useful. So lots of all the main shows. So I refereed lots of people from Thailand, Pinsin Chai, Duo, Kongodom, Liam Harrison many times, Damien many times, Sanchai a couple of times, other Thais, lots of Thais who came over, including a Thai v Thai fight in the UK, which was in Wales, which was unusual. Sitmern and Duo Kongodom they'd fought in Thailand, and I refereed them in Swansea. So a range of things, at one time it was shows every weekend really, and I was driving, sometimes drove to Scotland, did them in Scotland, and drive back, sleep on the car park, go to work. It was that very much a full-time passion, and
Yeah.
slightly different now. I've got a family, but then it was like every night training and every weekend taking fighters or refereeing.
Yeah, living the dream, obviously. And then also one of your fighters, Dean James, came out of your gym. Can you talk about, because he was at your gym for a long time and had a decent career? Yeah.
He still is. I mean, he still runs and coaches at the gym. Yeah, Dean does. Yeah, instrumental in doing that. So Dean, it was. So I was, as I mentioned, I was teaching at different gyms, and one was with my very good friend Charlie Joseph in Cheltenham, who did MMA as well, but I was used to teach Muay Thai there. Trojan at Wolverhampton, Kirkwood Walker, who was a very famous fighter at the time, asked me if I'd go and coach at the gym, and I said, "Look, I'm very happy to, but you have to realise it's quite a different style than you're doing." And he said, "Yeah, it's fine." So I was coaching at the time Winston Walker, who was a former world champion, Pete Crook, who was a world champion too. And at that time, so they were training at that point, and Dean walked into the gym at Wolverhampton. It was in a sports centre in a fairly sort of rough area of Wolverhampton. And he watched Pete kick pads, and he spoke to Winston, and he saw the lads fighting, and he'd had cancer. I didn't know at that point, but he was trying to get fit. His idea wasn't to come and fight; it was to say, train and get help recover. Really, and him and a friend turned up, Richard Wayne, and they both joined in. And I think they went back to another session because there was different people running sessions, and they didn't quite like it. So he was almost going to give up, but then persisted, came back, and then he wanted to come to to try to the other gyms. And directly after go and drive to a different area to teach at Pracho Sewer gym. So I'd teach at Wolverhampton, then drive to teach a bit later on. And he came with me, and he really connected with the people there. He really liked it. So whilst he did retain a connection with Winston and Pete, and Pete's brother Reese later on, who also fought for the gym, he really sort of took on the values of that gym. I think the Thai influence, and at that point we'd been Thais over quite regularly. So they'd be sleeping under my desk at uni because of the time difference, and whether that be Pinchin Chai Duo or a number of others. A series of maybe 10 or 12 different boxes over the period coming and staying. Top Attack Wanchalerm, who runs Simbi Gym in Phuket. He spent time with us as well. And Dean, again, his idea wasn't to fight. His idea was to train and get better and get fit. But I saw early on that he had an aptitude for the sport. He was also build-wise, he was very light and strong physically for his weight. And he was very coachable, so he'd listen very well. And he had a fight. We organised a fight in shin pads in Wolverhampton, actually. And he stopped the lad very early on, and he sort of got the bug, I think. I think one thing is when he realised it wasn't just about, because he didn't see himself as a rough, tough guy. But when he realised he could apply, it was a bit like, well, this could be a bit like physical chess. And you've got these techniques. He sort of realised actually he could do well in the sport, and got really engaged in it. We had and continue to do have a really good relationship, and always have over that period, from then onwards, really. His friend Richard trained and fought as well. But yeah, became, I guess the adage of the gym was all right from the days of Will Hastings was to look. I remember Will, he lost his first 4 fights ever, but they were against lads who were miles. Really, you wouldn't, if you were looking to win, you probably wouldn't have matched him with those fighters. They were to push the boundaries. Not that he'd get hurt because he was capable, but just that actually he didn't potentially have the skills to win. But that meant that he didn't lose for a long, long, long time after that. So he lost those first 4 fights. And that was the sort of the idea behind the gym, that let's look and push the boundaries. And we did that with Dean. So Dean was fighting people on paper you probably wouldn't have put him against. He was actually winning. He was doing really well, and he was winning. He understood the scoring. And that was an advantage. He understood, he'd come to Thailand with me. He understood the sport, and he really got into the technical aspects of it and the way training, etc. And he was also doing some teaching in school, so he had a very good understanding of coaching. I think how you connect with people. And then he did a degree, which he did it at Wolverhampton, but I helped support his sort of final thesis, his final dissertation, which was about Muay Thai, and helped him in some other ways. And we've had a bond ever since, really. And I think he's taken on a lot of the values of the gym. In fact, he's driven a lot of the values of the gym now, coaching. So yeah, that's how me and Dean met, and how our sort of relationship developed.
Just in terms of a time period, when did he start? When were some of his high points? I know he fought Andy Housen for the ISKA title a while ago.
Yeah, he did. He fought Rungavi, Andy Housen. He fought a few. He's fought a few. I think he's fought about 3 or 4 versions of world titles. So he's sort of maybe 36. He was 21 when he turned up to the gym. Initially, it took so early 20s. He was so I guess the first his real first world title of note was his fight against Andy in Manchester, and then again a follow-up fight in Leeds. But he also fought on a Muay Thai Muay Thai Council Against Drugs title against, I think he was Vietnamese ethnically, but I think he was from Sweden. And he won there on stoppage. And then he fought some guys from Nassau Gym, some really good fighters, tough, very tough fighters.
Oh, French guys.
French guys, yeah, from Nassau.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They were tough lads. Amin was very tough. Another couple of guys he won. He beat one lad for, again, a version of the world title in Warrington from that gym at 59 kilos. And then he fought one on World Muay Thai Grand Prix, the Muay Thai Grand Prix in London. Then he fought Runga V on Brian Calder's Yoke show and Brian Calder's show. Having lost to Runga V in Ireland, so he fought in the Republic of Ireland and lost on points, but he won on stoppage on Yoko. I guess his latest fight, he lost to a title. I think he was struggling to find fights at his weight, so he tried to move. So it obviously takes away some advantages. You know, he's probably his best weight fighting wise and competitively. He was between 50. He's fought 53 to 55, I think 55, but up to 57. But when it becomes in the 60s, that they're actually equal, well, bigger than him physically, and I think where they're equal technically. When they've been bigger and less technical, it's been fine. But when the ties are very good technically and bigger, I think that's always been a bit of a more challenging, really. But he's still on the book. He's still with COVID. Obviously, we haven't trained for a long time, but starting now that things are lifting. Hopefully next week I'll be back at the gym and he'll be kicking pads. And he wants to carry on, even though he's, people say, he wants an Indian summer of his career, really. So where he capitalises on some things and brings in some, I guess, that emotional maturity as you get a bit older. And there's always a point where it's optimal, and then perhaps it's a step too far. So but he's still interested very much in the sport. He's obviously actively coaching the sport. He's a very good judge, and he hasn't refereed, but he's a very good judge and good as a commentator. I've seen him explain things very well. I think he's good as a commentator too. But he's still passionate about the sport, and he does still want to fight. And so there's a couple of offers on the table, but it'll depend how his fitness, how he gets in terms of fitness and how he gets in shape, because it's been a while since he's been in, really.
And then sort of looking at maybe an overview of the UK's history in the sport, do you think, could you pick out maybe 3 or 4 defining moments, you would say, in the sport?
I think was where we were able to get ties into the UK to compete and fight. We have had some point before then, but I think regular people coming over and the changing of the rules and access, combined with the more free access to Thailand, made a difference. That was when people were able to go to Thailand, and we managed to get a consensus on the way that people judge the sport here was useful. Bringing Thais in to do seminars here for those who couldn't go to Thailand and they could still see it and people could explain it, I think was useful. Foreigners being successful. So, I mean, particularly I think the likes of Liam Harrison, but also Andy Howson, who'd fight everybody. I think I bought some ties over at the show in Wolverhampton. Duo Congadon fought Liam Harrison. Comkit, no, it wasn't Comkit. Cantipong fought Andy Howson. There was a few ties over. And that whilst they lost, they gave really good account of themselves. And actually, Duo then went back to work. He came to stay with me again the following year. And Richard Smith said, would he be prepared to come up to Badco? And said, yeah, definitely. So he went up to teach at Badco. He taught, he got a good relationship with Liam and with Andy and James, who was up there. And, he enjoyed his time up there. And I think those experiences, were sort of boosted.
And then how would you sort of categorize or talk about the current state of affairs in the UK in terms of the Muay Thai scene? Obviously, we have COVID, but, besides that.
People's ideas about the sport, and I think it's, and because whilst Liam and Andy lost, they accepted they lost and they understood why they lost. I think that was important from before just losing or winning and the rules being different than the Thai fighter thought, or that I'd refereed fights where I thought, hang on, the Thai guys won clearly, but he didn't get the decision. I think it started to change then, and that was important for both the public to see it. It was, debates online, and there was a shift. And I think that those sort of things, and people, UK fighters doing well abroad and fighting in Thailand and doing well was also important. Damien Hood I had went and fought at Rajdamnern and won at Rajdamnern. Then he fought a very good boxer in the provinces who hadn't been beaten. He was smaller, to be fair, but hadn't been beaten for a long time, couldn't get opponents. And whilst Damien got battered for about 4 rounds, managed to stop him in the end. And I think the experiences of people. So I think those were defining moments, really. The big shows coming in to the UK, where promoters were prepared to bring ties in and make the sport look more professional and polished was going forward, and generally Thailand being, I guess, more outward facing and trying to market the sport differently also had an impact. I think prior to COVID, it's healthy. I think there's a number of there's lots of shows across the UK. I think it's a healthy, it's a bit pre-COVID. Hopefully, it'll carry on being that now. Things are settling down again, but there's a number of full-time gyms set up, number of commercial gyms. Some of those have fighting arms, so they some there is still some independent gyms. With the gym I run, and Prato Theory isn't commercial, but a number of gyms are in Birmingham. There are lots of gyms there, some highly successful gyms, and I think that's obviously important. For the sport for those individuals to push it. There's a number of professional setups in terms of promotions. The links with Yoko to get ties in, Muay Thai Grand Prix in London, but there are also lots and lots of other shows, and that's healthy. I think the idea, in a way, that now it's not just a single governing body able to run it, that a promoter's able to, a bit like one, where it's a promotion team or UFC. I think they're models that people have looked at and sort of take it on board, really. So it's more about, a particular brand and what do we do differently and how do we market ourselves. I think that's positive in a way, because it means that, there is development there. I think, people have done very well. Some fighters coming through the UK have done very well, and we'll see where that goes, really, with whether they go into the One Championships or they do other things that are, Muay Thai Max, whatever it happens to be. I think that, Thailand are outward facing, and these polished shows, wherever that happens to generate from, I think that's good. I think it's really good for the UK to get people in there, because it aspires others who are coming along to see, I want to be like that. It's that spark of interest and role models that drives people to want to do the sport. And sport always changes and shifts. Every sport, but to have that, I want to be like them. That's somebody I want to aspire to be like in all sorts of ways is great for the sport. And I think that's positive for the UK, positive for those coming through. And a number of outlets, they can go a lot of different places now to train, whereas before it was much more limited.
Yeah, awesome. And so just wrapping things up, is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
No, not really. Other than no. I think we've covered lots of things. Really, I think there's, I think the future for Muay Thai looks very bright. I think, internationally that's great. I don't know where it'll end up in the Olympics. Obviously, it's a slightly different sport, the amateur sport, but it's still a great sort of selling point if he does get there. On a more sort of traditional sport footing. The traditional sports and Olympic funding, etc. But the professional sport, I think's looking very healthy. There's hopefully it'll carry on getting that momentum. The sport, obviously, it's all about funding, and it needs different models of funding it. Whether that's online, whether it's what But I think people now, there's enough people involved in the sport to see its potential, and so I can only see it growing in that way. That's great, and I think the UK scene's positive. Hopefully, post-COVID, things will pick back up again. And I am passionate about getting sports science, and trying to get some of these things in terms of both coaching, technical aspects of Muay Thai, which I think probably a little bit falls behind some sports. And some sports have got lots of sports science support, in the way that, whether it's biomechanics or techniques or whether it's psychological support or whatever. My own hope would be that some of the research we're able to do will be able to inform that, and coaches can take advantage of some of the stuff that we produce. And the more people involved, the better. And we're trying to get a number of ties at the moment. It's all the people who've gone through that sort of technique thing have been European, well, basically mostly UK fighters. But I'll continue to try and grow that, because I think the more people we get through there, the different people, the more we can make conclusions, draw conclusions about techniques, or whether based on body type. So I think it differs depending on physiology, as well as psychology, and understanding those will be quite important. But
right, totally.
So I guess that's a hope that we can inform even better the sport in all ways with sort of science and research would be one thing to finish on.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Tony. I really appreciate it. Is there a place for people to find your articles or to find out more about you and your gym?
Yeah, so there is some place, I guess, for the articles. I probably have to update it a little bit. So it's what I'll do is I can give you the link. There is a website on judging that I put together. I haven't probably updated for a long time, so I can stick the newer stuff on there. But there's some clips on judging and things on there as well that people might want to access. Yeah. So I'll give you that. I'll send you that.
Yeah, I've seen it before. It's a good resource. So again, thank you for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks for the invite. Great to speak to you.
So a very good interview with Tony. I really appreciate him taking his time out. He's a very busy man working for Birmingham University. He has the gym going. He has this and that. And he's still doing research papers. He's working with Stefan Straubmeyer on several papers, and definitely hope to see more academic work and studies come out from him. So a real good example for the Muay Thai community and what you can do in the Muay Thai world without necessarily having to be a fighter. There are other options for people, and it's really worth exploring. And he's made a lot of traction, a lot of headway with what he's done, and a lot of improvements for the sport. So just want to say thank you again for Tony for taking your time out. He also has a very in-depth and informative podcast with Don Heatrick, so you can check that out. I believe it's the Building of Champions, the Science of Building Champions with Don Heatrick. So definitely recommend that. And thank you once again, Tony, for coming on the show today. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you, as always, for listening. And once again, if you like this show and if you like the content, it would be great if you could share, leave a review on iTunes, and really support the show and what I'm doing here. If you'd like to reach me, you can follow me on Instagram at Lucas Muay Thai or email me at a.matt.lucas@gmail.com. As always, this has been On Fighting in Thailand, the best news and analysis covering the economics and infrastructure of Muay Thai. I'm Matt Lucas, journalist, commentator, and ex-Muay Thai fighter. Make stronger fighters, make stronger people.
This show was edited by Effie Ceruti. You can find me on Instagram at Effie_FC or on Facebook at Effie Ceruti.